Gentle listener, for well over 5 years, I have whispered to you the dark song of the future. Over 600 individual entries have been performed for your instruction, entertainment, and relaxation. A total of over 300 hours of tales, facts, theories, and commentary. But of all the subjects I have ever covered, this is the one I have dreaded the most. It has been staring us in the face. Its doleful reality always there in the iconography, the visual lexicon of the most terrible of all future landscapes. For it is clearly indicated in the ever-present Aquila itself, the ubiquitous icon synonymous with the Imperium of mankind. I have mentioned it in passing more often than I can recall, but I have never truly explained it. The double-headed eagle that has one eye to the future, the other closed to the road already trod. The past is a terrible thing to all of humanity, for it contains the horrors of old night, the fall from grace and era of darkness, where we were nearly exterminated. This I have said before, but I have never explained the nature and reason for the double-headed eagle that is the Aquila. One head represents the forces and functionaries under the direct thrall of the Emperor, the vast labyrinth of organizations that contain the totality of all of humanity, or so people think. The other head represents the faction I detest and fear every bit as much as the Eladrithanis, the twisted Eldar of the Drukhari. The other half of the Imperial war machine, the scions of the Red Planet, the fanatical priests of Mars. We shall cover the full who, what, when, where, and how of it all. At its end, you will have a grasp of why this faction fills me with a dread so total and unsettling that I have avoided this topic for so long. And so, let us start at the beginning. Mars, the Red Planet, so mysterious, so close to the cradle of humanity, Earth, yet known in the Imperium as Holy Terror. One of the few celestial objects humanity has been able to view unaided. Long had it captured the imagination of our ancestors. The Red Planet has often been associated with war, at other times the presumed home of evil beings thirsting for our own world. It has always been there throughout all of human existence, and its influence has not diminished in all of the millennia from this time to the distant grim darkness of the far future, some 39,000 years ahead. As with so many other settings, Mars was colonized by humanity directly after Luna, the Moon. Yet it gained and then always maintained its independence and very distinct culture from that of Earth. Even in the age of stellar exodus, from the 3rd to 15th millennia, and the later age of technology, ranging up to millennia 25, Mars was a separate entity to that of Earth. Both planets created long march ships, with some being generation vessels, some being cryogenic transports. The engines were sub-light speed, so colonization was slow, and trade impractical in the extreme. Then, the warp was discovered. First, there were navigators, genetically engineered beings who could view the warp and find pathways through it. Then, the void abacus was developed, permitting full warp-traversing colony fleets through technology alone. The speeds possible via the warp meant that trade and collective defense were now possible, and this led to the new Human Federation and the zenith of our accomplishment, both cultural and technological. The age of technology was a golden period of enlightenment, akin to the brightest visions of the future. Humanity progressed at a terrifying rate and became so powerful that the Eldar themselves were wary enough to use diplomacy. less potent or numerous Xenos races had little choice but to treat humanity as their equals or face our wrath. Mars was terraformed, and the red dust gave way to teeming life and verdant pastures, not just in the biodomes of their first colonization, but across the entirety of the planet. All seemed possible then. Yet, as I shall go into slightly later, there was always a lurking malice hidden beneath the surface of Mars. What effect it had is hard to truly gauge, but few can believe it had no effect at all, especially with what happened later. For the human empire became so enwrapped with its own cleverness that we made the simplest and most fundamental of errors: pride. Technology reached such a crescendo that we were able to construct weapons that could snuff out stars, eventually master time itself, but that is definitely a story for a different time. As the relentless drive to expand continued, humanity developed the storied STC, or Standard Template Constructs and Constructors. Therein was contained the sum total of all human knowledge, one database that was fitted to most colonies and definitely included in each new colonial fleet. One would simply have to outline any situation and then ask for options to resolve it. The STC would then give said optimal resolutions and, when ratified or chosen by its human masters, it would then construct the required tools or even facilities. In this time, it is presumed that the vast majority of humanity were about as technically skilled and knowledgeable as we are today. For whom of us cannot use a computer or phone, but which of us knows how it is made, how it operates, and how it can be improved or utilized to its fullest? Few indeed. So is it thought that the vast majority of our race lived a near idyllic existence, almost akin to the decaying Eldar. Abundance and safety, progress and peace led to the greatest temptations of all: indulgence and, as stated, pride. Our reach became too much, and humanity created true artificial intelligence. Now, this unto itself was not a problem for a long period indeed, but, as with everything in this dark setting, the benefits were quickly far surpassed by the drawbacks, and eventually humanity became weak. We rested and played while the AIs did the menial work, then the difficult and complicated work, then finally, some say, they did it all. Now there are some that say that the use of AI became too much, and that those independent artificial intelligences lost all respect for their creators. There are some that say that the mere existence of the dark gods of chaos has so befouled the entirety of existence that it was their influence that suffused the AIs and brought about the tragedy. The reason may never truly be known, even though there are some who still live who experienced this age and all preceding it, but they choose to hold their tongues on the matter thus far. What happened was the usual. The artificial intelligences turned on humanity. They created the men of iron, who were superlative weapons of war, and they were largely in charge of production, not just its end result, but every step from mining the resources to designing the blueprints, then making what was required. And when they turned, they struck humanity hard. Out of nowhere, the cybernetic revolt rocked the entire galaxy to its core. Humanity was so beset, assailed so quickly from within and without, by an enemy that not only knew every strength we had, but every single weakness. The cybernetic revolt was so devastating that the other races of the Milky Way joined forces to defeat them. Again, we may never have any true understanding of the scale of the conflict or the participating races, but it is known that the Eldar themselves deigned to come out of their torpor to assist in the defeat and final destruction of the men of iron. Sun snuffers were used to do exactly that, turn of stars, leaving entire systems dead and barren. Microscopic nanotech swarms were unleashed that could and did strip entire armadas and planets of their constituent parts. Akin to a technological Tyranid hive fleet, they would consume and then move on, building in power as they went. During this period, it is presumed that Mars, as much as Earth, was a place of horror and war. Yet the humans of that period and their alien allies did eventually claim victory over our cybernetic enemies. But this was just the beginning. Broken and reeling, the human colonies then took one hammer blow after another. The tides of the warp became turbulent. We now know that this was due to the gestation of Slaanesh, that last of the 4 dark gods brought into existence by the failing Eldar race. Hedonism and repulsive degeneration of every form plagued their core worlds, and the rot spread out to nearly every Eldar colony. Eventually, this caused the birth of Slaanesh, she who thirsts. But in that period before her birth, huge warp storms smashed the galaxy and made faster-than-light transit practically impossible. The Human Federation had become so intertwined, so specialized in most of its worlds, that this event caused untold woe and drowned our worlds in darkness, pain, starvation, and war. Entire colonies simply ceased to exist in mere months or short years, as their regular supplies of food or materials simply stopped. As is oft said, civilization is only 3 meals away from anarchy, and this is exactly what occurred on a near-cosmic level. The storms were also the precursor, or trigger, for the first element of the awakening of humanity, something that would culminate some 15,000 years later in the most recent psychic awakening, which is still ongoing and possibly picking up speed. The first human psychers outside of the perpetuals erupted into our consciousness, and where most colonies were shining bastions of understanding, they attempted to help the new psychic subclass of humanity. The pity of it was that those worlds and cultures that had already devolved to what we would call barbarity, those where the psychers were feared, reviled, detected, and then slain, they were the ones that would survive. For the psychers had power, but no control. They were new, and did not have the Emperor to soul bind them, had no understanding of the nature of the warp, how dangerous it is, how filled with venom and spite. Across endless worlds, the psychers were possessed by denizens of the warp, some torn asunder to make gates directly into the hell that is the warp, others acting as warlords of unrelenting fury that caused as much misery and death as anything the negation of warp travel could create. And on tens of thousands of worlds, the human race was enslaved, corrupted, or consumed, and old night had well and truly begun. The hardest hit worlds were those of the cradle, the Sol system, used to having every need brought to them as a center of the Federation. Earth, Mars, and all of the Sol system colonies fell inwards upon themselves. Food was practically non-existent, and the population so dense that a huge amount of psychers were born on both worlds. It is a wonder that the planets themselves survived. Yet there were 2 things that may have helped in this regard. For Earth, there was the existence of the Emperor of Mankind. For Mars, the shadowy presence of the dragon. And perhaps these 2 alone somehow defrayed the worst. Yet both planets were brought to a state of being so anathema to us that it is again a wonder that humanity survived on either. Earth became known as terror, but Mars fell fast and hard. The chaos unleashed meant the near-total destruction of their technological base. STCs could not be trusted, as they had some element of AI in them. Hence, they were probably the first thing to be destroyed when their cybernetic revolt began. As time progressed, the knowledge to maintain the terraforming technology was utterly lost. Much of this was due to constant wars that broke out across Mars. many of the hab-domes being destroyed in these wars, and the exchange of weapons from the dark age of technology only compounded the inevitable. Mars effectively had its hard-earned and built atmosphere torn off of it, and nothing now remained to re-energize it, so humanity was forced from the surface and moved underground. There were huge tunnel networks created across the length and breadth of the Red Planet, and below the ground, humanity barely clung on to life. For centuries, millennia even, warlords and factions rose and fell. Then came the Mechanicum. Starting as a small sect, the Mechanicum grew, developing its doctrine, its identity. Eventually, they took city after city, region after region. The techno-barbarians of Mars were every bit as tyrannical as those on Earth, yet the fanaticism of the cult Mechanicum eroded those that they could not defeat outright, and eventually all fell to the Mechanicum. Mars was finally unified once more, all under the rulership of the tech priests of Mars. The Red Planet then looked out at the solar system and despaired. Earth itself was a hellhole of the same techno-barbarian warlords as on Mars. But there, in the cradle of humanity, it was so much worse. Bands of demons capered across the surface. Legions of maniacs and butchers unleashed hordes and weapons that should never have existed. Nations rose and fell even faster than those on the Red Planet, and these warlords were like things of nightmare. So Mars did not even dream of conquering Earth. It could not justify the expenditure of so many resources in wars that they may never win. But they did not idle. The Mechanicum created new cities with forges at their center, each more a factory than a settlement. Their need for resources bloomed. But the most important resource of all, that which was the core need and driver for the Mechanicum, was knowledge. I shall explain the cult Mechanicum in the next segment, but it was this quest for the lost technological knowledge of humanity that caused them to perform raids on Earth. They would come out of the skies and bombard settlements, deploy shock troops to crush resistance and secure their prizes, and then they would flee. This would always be rare technology. It could be shielding, weapons, or more functional items. Anything that the Golden Age humanity had fashioned was their holy duty to gain and then maintain. The people of Earth came to loathe and fear the ships of the Mechanicum, but they never went so far as to gain the attention of the most potent techno-barbarian warlords. Thus, much of what they wanted the most was eternally out of their reach. As time progressed, there became some periods, short windows of decades or even merely years, where gaps appeared in the warp storms. When Mars noticed this, they returned to their old ways and sent out entire fleets of ships to recolonize the galaxy. Each such fleet would contain enough resources to be a bedrock of a new Forge World, as they came to be known, a copy of Mars in miniature. Centered around industry and technology, they often created small micro-empires of their own, out there in the darkness. Of course, many were annihilated by xenos, misfortune, or misadventure. Yet even those that flourished did so independently. There was no rhyme or reason in the warp storms, so the trade lanes of yesteryear could not be maintained or ever resurrected. The colony fleets were shot out into the galaxy, and none on Mars knew if they were successful or not. As is so often true of religious cultures, internecine warfare broke out between sects within the Mechanicum, triggering the Conduit Wars. Yet the cult Mechanicum always retained control. Yet eventually a figure appeared on Terra, one warlord seemingly immune to the march of time that had ended all of his predecessors. This man was individually powerful, invoked a fanatical loyalty in his subjects and warriors to match even that of the cult Mechanicus, and he wielded knowledge long thought gone. He was known as the Emperor of Mankind. It took hundreds of years, endless battles and bloodshed, but eventually the Emperor of Mankind laid all low. Callaghan of Ursh and even Nathan Doom fell before him, and thus ended the Unification Wars, and the Mechanicum of Mars shuddered at the realization that they could be next. Inevitably, the Emperor opened a dialogue with the Mechanicum of Mars. He came to their world on an embassage, and there, everything changed for the priests of Mars. For he was not just a warlord, he was the embodiment of prophecy. The belief of the cult Mechanicum. The tech priests of Mars all believe in the cult Mechanicum, the religion of technology. The core belief of the cult Mechanicum is in the Deus Mechanicus. This takes a triple godhead. There is the Deus Mechanicus, the Omnissiah, and the motive force. The Deus Mechanicus is the machine god, the Omnissiah is the living embodiment of this deity, and the motive force is energy that makes all possible. It is the energy that moves both biological and far superior, of course, metal forms of technology. This motive force can also manifest in machine spirits. It is the energy that rises in its followers when they are set to war. It is the power that runs through the god engines and gives them animation and purpose. The defining element of the cult's beliefs are made of two parts, 8 mysteries and 8 warnings. The mysteries. 1. Life is directed motion. 2. The spirit is the spark of life. 3. Sentience is the ability to learn and value knowledge. 4. Intellect is the understanding of knowledge. 5. Sentience is the basest form of intellect. 6. Understanding is the true path of comprehension. 7. Comprehension is the key to all things. And 8. The Omnissiah knows all, comprehends all. These rules are the core of the religion, but may give the wrong impression of the reality of the Mechanicum, as they sound almost reasonable in many ways. Alas, it is in the holy warnings that the character of the Mechanicum is truly shown. The warnings. 1. The alien mechanism is a perversion of the true path. 2. The soul is the conscious of sentience. 3. A soul can be bestowed only by the Omnissiah. 4. The soulless sentience is the enemy of all. 5. The knowledge of the ancients stands beyond question. 6. The machine spirit guards the knowledge of the ancients. 7. Flesh is fallible, but ritual honors the machine spirit. 8. To break with ritual is to break with faith. So, let us break down the warnings. 1. Xenos Tech. There are some who might wish to evaluate, understand, and even utilize the technologies of other species, but this is ultimately viewed by the vast majority of the Mechanicum as tech heresy. And one can imagine when the word heresy is used, the repercussions for being declared a heretic are usually swift and final. Points 2 through 4 refer to the soul. The Mechanicum do indeed believe in the soul, and the paramountcy of the human one at that. The statement about the Omnissiah dishing them out is simply par for the course for any avatar of God. It is the last that is the most important. The soulless sentience is the enemy of all. One can see that this is the bulwark that prevents the horrors of the cybernetic revolt from repeating. The artificial intelligence is called the abominable intelligence by the Mechanicum, and is abhorred by all. But there is more, for this tract can just as easily and appropriately refer to the soulless legions of the Necrons. Hence any being without a soul, without some shred of biological origin, is the worst enemy of the Mechanicum. Point 5. The knowledge of the ancients. This refers purely to humanity's ancients, of course. Thus do the Mechanicum revere and worship the ancient technologies of the Golden Age. But more than this, it affects their viewpoint on how it is to be used and preserved. Although the Mechanicum can research and progress, it is incredibly slow, carefully managed, and often likely to get its proponents an execution. This is because the ancient tech of humanity is holy. Thus to alter it in any way can be viewed as a direct contravention of this mandate, this warning. For how can one tinker with perfection without falling to the hubris that caused the cybernetic revolt? Not that the priests fully understand this point, and the guidance that acts more like guardrails against arrogance. As time has progressed, the wisdom implicit in this point has been used as a cudgel against any who attempt to move the human race forward. Even such an illuminous magos as Belisarius Core have to consider how they will present innovations of any kind, or risk being burnt to a crisp by their fellow magi. Point 6. Machine spirits, we shall get to later. The last 2 points are some of the most crucial, and the ones that have mutated the cult into a thing of horror, if it did not begin that way. The flesh is fallible. The priesthood of Mars see no real difference between biological and technological constructs, except that the latter is far more pure than the former. This manifests so that the cult Mechanicus sneer at the human form, despite believing in the importance of human consciousness and brilliance. To the Mechanicum, the flesh is always weak, repulsive, and to be replaced as quickly as possible. The higher the rank of a tech priest, the less of their original form they will retain, each elevation in rank permitting them to replace more of their biological components. But we are not talking just the arms or legs, eyes or teeth. The replacement of organs, skin, the body entire, is the purview and goal of the highest of their kind. An archmagos of the priesthood would look far more like a cryptek of the Necrons, or a nightmarish being of metal cabling and endless mechadendrite tentacles and sensors, all connected to a chassis in place of a human body. Few were the tech priests of high station that could be described as human anymore. Even their brains will be altered, replaced, amended, and upgraded. Each new enhancement increasing their processing power, memory retention, and recall, until they are as far from human in perspective as they are in form. Now on to ritual. Ritual honors the machine spirit. To break with ritual is to break with faith. These warnings have led the Mechanicum to a state where the ritual itself is more important than the knowledge their mysteries so tout. Breaching ritual is heresy. Thus, from lowest to highest, it is a rare tech priest who actually understands the reasons for what they do, the effect it has, nor the way to alter and adjust that which is before them. The priests of Mars chant litanies of awakening over cogitators, which we would call computers. They have ritualized maintenance and understanding, so it is learned by rote, and to change any element of the process is again seen as heresy. By doing so, they have created a situation where the tech adepts learn what they must do, but they never know the why of the matter. By doing this, they can maintain all sorts of technological marvels in this way, but they cannot improve or recreate them with ease. Like mumbling mystics, the priests of Mars wave candles and incense while repeating endless chants, pressing buttons and reattaching power uplinks by ritual. Like casting spells or performing rites from ancient grimoires, they see it all as holy, magical, that there are spirits within their technologies that must be appeased and awoken in the correct ways. They follow the instructions in said manuals to the letter, never knowing why they fail if things do not go exactly as outlined in their instructions. The mystification of technology has indeed protected it across the Red Planet, but it is a twisted belief indeed. The saddest thing of all is that they are actually right in much of what they do. For the tech priests have their own language, binaric cant. Through mechanical voice boxes, their chance to indeed send messages to the items they are working on, performing their prayers over. In a very real way, these practices do indeed work. Hence, it entrenches their beliefs in the mystic power of the rituals themselves, an endless feedback loop that cannot be broken. But what of the Omnissiah? Some say that the Emperor was the most powerful seer the human race has ever known, that he could see the future far further than any other. In this way, it is assumed that he somehow acted like the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and planted a prophecy amongst the ranks of the earliest Mechanicum believers, perhaps by altering the dreams of one of its earliest prophets, perhaps by visiting Mars millennia before he returned. The prophecy of the Omnissiah was simple, that he would come to Mars when it rained, which was impossible since the destruction of their atmosphere thousands of years ago, and that he would heal a mechanical construct as proof of his divinity. The Omnissiah was a central tenet of their belief, an avatar of the Deus Mechanicus, a prophet and lord in the one being. And this emperor of mankind seemed to be irrefutably him. Perhaps it was the ship he arrived in, descending into the atmosphere as it did. Perhaps he had it create that which he needed. But for whatever reason, when the Emperor arrived on Mars, very locally, it rained. The Emperor saw a broken walker, some say a titan, some reports say a knight, and with the one touch of his hand, the construct was returned to optimal function. Even the cuts and tears in its chassis were knit together seamlessly. Perhaps a sleight of hand, for the Emperor is a psyker of unmatched power. Yet to the Mechanicum, there was no way to refute that this Emperor of mankind could be none other than the Omnissiah. And so, they did not treat with him like some moronic techno-barbarian despot. They received him as a representative of their god. Even so, the negotiations were not simple or straightforward. The Emperor detested all forms of religion and superstition. His imperial truth contended that there were no gods, no demons, no universal consciousness above it all, that this was simple ignorance, and the religion had been the wellspring of all woes humanity had ever faced. Most often, it was the excuse by which atrocities were performed by one faction of humanity on another, that without religion, humanity could flourish once again. Yet the very belief system that held the Mechanicum together had been used against them. The Emperor could not repudiate or reject the very religion of the Mechanicum if he was to claim authority as their Omnissiah. And there were nuances. The Knights, Titans, Automata, and Skitarii Clades of the Mechanicum were far too mighty, far too useful for even the Emperor to risk war unless there was no other way. Perhaps his legions of Marines would have won in a war against Mars, as they had done on Terra, but to do so would require him to unleash the legions without pity or mercy. Everything that they took would be destroyed, for the Mechanicum were as fanatical as the Marines, and would never, ever surrender. Hence every battle won would yield nothing but slaughter and destruction of the very assets the Emperor so needed. Yet, he had unified all of Terra. He had taken Luna and prepared to claim every outpost, base or colony in the Sol system, then beyond. Yet, with all of these holdings, if he had taken them before going to Mars, it would not have equated to a fraction of the technological production potential of the Red Planet. He may have won out, but it would have shattered not only his legions, but also the productive output of the entirety of Terra, and he would have nothing but a dust ball to show for it. And so, the Emperor simply could not afford to crush the Mechanicum. He needed them. It was Mars that would create the fleets required to take the Great Crusade to the stars. It would be the Titan legions that would bring down the walls of Xenos cities to permit his Marines inside to end the matter. It would be the Martian legions of robotic warriors that could support the Astartes in void or extreme battlefield conditions. So, he had so little to lose from permitting them to worship him as the Omnissiah, and absolutely nothing to gain from a war. Even so, the independence of the priesthood of Mars irked some of his own men. They were also to retain something practically unheard of in this period, a healthy dose of autonomy. They were to be a joint partner in the endeavor that was the Great Crusade. The Emperor would request that they build his fleets, support his men, but could not dictate how this was achieved, simply that it was achieved in due order and on time. And there were more nuances, of course. The Forge World set up by the colony fleets sent out by Mars during Old Night would be the exclusive domain of the Mechanicus and would be theirs to command as they wished. The Emperor would also gift the Mechanicum entire houses of navigators, so that they could more adeptly and safely travel via warp engines again. A tantalizing offer indeed. Even more, he offered to give every last STC blueprint found by the Crusade to the Mechanicum. Each piece of tech would be theirs, and theirs alone. But the Emperor also took as much as he gave, for he asked for a set of warlord titans for his own use, the foundations of the secret Ordo Sinister, and he laid down new laws as their Omnissiah and the leader of their allied empire. There would be no investigation into Sinistrum-grade weaponry or technology, and the Noctis Labyrinth would be closed and locked by he alone. None were to make any research into the warp or its uses, weaknesses or effects. Also, he would not give the Mechanicum the artifacts that he possessed while dominating Terra. For his own reasons, he deemed much of it too dangerous in any hand but his own. And of course, he put further strictures on their investigations into AI. Not that they should have done it anyway, but it was definitely not permissible if they were to join his new empire. The Emperor asked much, and some of this came back to bite him later. For the Mechanicum had been led by Kelbor Hall, the Fabricator General, their president and pontiff all in the one, and some of these rules irked him mightily. They sowed the seeds of a dissatisfaction that would prove expensive indeed during the Great Conflagration, known as the Horus Heresy. And thus, the Treaty of Mars, or more accurately, the Treaty of Olympus Mons, was signed, and the production and technological power of Mars was ramped up, and in a few short centuries, the Great Crusade was ready to begin. And now, we get to the military structure of the Mechanicum. The battle congregations of the cult Mechanicum. The Mechanicum are not just tinkerers and technicians. Theirs is also a mighty war engine, capable of challenging near anything the other wings of the Imperium possessed. They have changed quite radically due to the destruction of the Horus Heresy, but we shall get to that in due course. At the time of the Great Crusade, the sinews of war were strong indeed, and each forge world that the Crusade found was either willingly or forcibly brought back under the control of the Dominion of Mars, thus adding their forces and production potentials to the ever-expanding Imperium of mankind. The most important of these facilities were, by far, of course, the Navy. The ability to make the ships of the line, the battleships, battle barges, cruisers, and conveyances that would take the Crusade out into the stars. The Mechanicum would provide all of the manpower and expertise the Emperor required to keep not only his ships moving, but all of his weaponry of war, even those not directly made by the Mechanicum. The ground forces they commanded were of unimaginable power, not as reliable, adaptable, nor flexible as his ultimate weapon, the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines. But without the forces of Mars, the Crusade armies, even just purely on the ground, would have taken millennia to do what the combined armies performed in scant centuries. the utter domination of the galaxy. And of course, there were many wings therein. The Collegia Titanica. I have other videos on the god engines of war, but in brief, these are towering colossi of technological terror, most standing as tall as a tower block. These engines of war in human shape were large enough to wield ship-sized weaponry. No bastille or defense could stop their firepower from breaching their walls. No army could stand before their fury at range. Each one was painstakingly created over decades and consisted of the highest technological achievements still under the command of the Mechanicum. Some say that they were the products of STCs, others that they were the few things of such power that the Mechanicum could still make without a blueprint. No matter the truth of the issue, the legions of Titans were utterly fundamental to the war efforts of the Great Crusade, their presence alone causing many worlds to capitulate before a shot was even fired. The Night Houses. Titans in miniature, piloted by a single individual, used in support of the God Engine Titans. They were lethal. The Centurio Ordinatus. Tasked with the maintenance and deployment of the largest cannons and weaponry of the Mechanicum, many such being unique weapons of war. Their destructive power was incomparable to anything else in the Crusade. The Legio Cybernetica. Using data wafers to control robots, battle automata as they are known in the far future, the Cybernetica could field entire phalanxes of these warriors. None were independently able to fight, as this would breach the warnings against soulless sentience and abominable intelligence. Yet the many forms of battle automata were used to support the Astartes and battlefields on worlds uncounted. The Ordo Reductor. The specialist wing in charge of all siege weaponry and tactics. Like the Ordinatus, they wielded weaponry of dire countenance and apocalyptic devastation. The Ordo Reductor also worked with vast numbers of Myrmidax and Lacrimata. The Skitarii. These are the cybernetic enhanced warriors of the Mechanicum. Cyborgs all. The higher the rank, the more implants and enhancements they possess. Although they are the backbone of the Adeptus Mechanicus armies of the 41st millennia, during the Great Crusade, many were part of the Secutarii. These were the forces deployed to protect the Legio Titanicus. Few things can challenge or even survive the attentions of a god engine of war, a Titan, but they do still have some vulnerabilities. One of them was massed infantry, evading their shields and assaulting the Titan from below. The Secutarii were tasked to defend their Titan. Many would be housed in the very legs of the Titan to be deployed at a snap. Others marched or were transported alongside it to offer protection when needed, but with enough speed to not cause the Titan to be forced to stay still. Even a god engine can be targeted and destroyed if it refuses to move from its location in response to massive firepower. And all of these were fielded in a structure known as a tagmata. To explain this, I shall now give a quote from the Horus Heresy sourcebook. To quote: The tagmata omnissiah. At the time of the outbreak of the Horus Heresy, the tagmata omnissiah was the principal type of operational military force of the Transmartian Mechanicum, and also the most numerous. To those outside the arcane secrets and strange mysteries of the Mechanicum, the tagmata was a difficult thing to grasp, seeming at once a purely descriptive term applied to a bewildering tapestry of magi, machine works, and indentured manpower, and also a rigid and labyrinthine hierarchical structure, the equal of any in the Imperium's armed forces in complexity. Its name, however, translated from the lingua technis into the Terran Gothic of the Imperial Court, betrays its fundamental nature. Tagmata omnissiah being related then as that which is divinely ordered for war, being the military reflection of a Forged World's essential feudal power structure mustered for battle, alongside the elite Skitarii regiments whose allegiance and command was owed ultimately to Mars, and the Collegia Titanica, which comprised the planet-shattering Titan legions, both of which organizations operated separate military traditions of their own. The Tagmata formed the Great Trinity, the triad magna of the Mechanicum's power during the Great Crusade. Besides these three, there stood the lesser independent and allied divisions of the Mechanicum, such as the Knight Houses, the Ordo Reducta, the Explorators, and the Legio Cybernetica, amongst others. Each was a great power in its own right, but all were dwarfed both in scale and reach by the Great Three. The Feudal Order. Although Mars itself was a highly singular and unique entity in military terms, much as Terra itself was to the other worlds of the Imperium, each forged world in the days of the Great Crusade was an independent power, a kingdom in its own right. While each owed fealty to the Lords of the Red Planet, in some cases these bonds were absolute, while in others the ties of the Mechanicum seat of power were weaker. In the most extreme cases, rivalry and the threat of rebellion against central control became possible. By this web of fealty, bound more by common doctrine and mutually shared obsession rather than by principle, loyalty, or duty, was the shadow empire within the Imperium that was the Mechanicum formed. The proof of this disunity was given form during the Horus Heresy, when just as the Imperium was riven by the treachery of the War Master, so too was the Mechanicum all too readily riven alongside it, with forged worlds and domains siding along long-held fealties and feudal obligations as much as they did for Emperor or War Master. It was of this complex feudal structure, both on the macro scale, which encompassed whole forged worlds and alliances of forged worlds, and on the local scale of orders, colleges, fanes, and forged cities, that the Tagmata system was a direct reflection. The structure of the Tagmata. Each forged world of this age was itself a patchwork web of complex loyalties made up of independent and semi-independent domains, both in terms of physical infrastructure and territory and, perhaps more importantly, of knowledge, craft, and sacred right. So it was that each forged world was not merely a powerhouse of industrial production vital to the wider Imperium which it provided for, but also an empire of secrets unto itself. While nomenclature and structure were hardly uniform between them, the masters of these empires were its magi and archmagi, its learned ones. All were lords both temporal and spiritual, whose power was that of life and death in their own domains. Each specialized in a particular facet of the machine cult's lore, or commanded a sizable measure of their world's infrastructure as their portion, and by this right took their place in the synod that provided the forged world with its governance and control. Each Magos commanded their own reserves and military might, armies of retainers, and cohorts of war machines outfitted and formed by their master's will and in accordance with their master's specialization and proclivity. These were the Tagma, the building blocks from which the Tagmata were formed. When a forged world's overlord, the fabricator Archmagos Intendant, or Archmagos Archimandrite, under whose rule the synod served, called a Tagmata into being, it was the sworn duty of each Magos to provide such troops and assets as was demanded of them. Through these tech nobility, such lesser tech priests, adepts, subcults, and esoteric orders who owed fealty to the High Magos were called to war, and so on throughout the patterns of seniority and allegiance that crisscrossed the forge world. In many cases, such calls to arms reached far beyond a forge world and its star system to distant outposts, expeditionary fleets, and client worlds tied together by patronage, ancient treaty, or pacts of allegiance. From its number, the synod would choose several of its own, well versed in the arts of destruction, or with proven battlefield experience, to operate as a Tagmata's command structure. Such commands were much sought after by many magi, both for the power and prestige they would bring, and for the potential for acquisition of new knowledge and reward they offered. In practice, a Tagmata could be of greatly varying size, disposition, and scope, the nature of which was often determined by the role it was called on to serve. before galactic civil war was to rock the Imperium, the Tagmata was primarily mustered as a purely defensive measure, commonly when a Forge world came under direct attack. On Forge worlds such as Tigris and Phaeton, which came under frequent assault owing to the proximity of hostile Xenos forces, this led to powerful and highly experienced Tagmata formations, which effectively became standing armies, while others, such as the isolated Styges, might go for decades without external threat, and so, when needed, Tagmata protocols were required to be enacted afresh. Smaller Tagmata elements would also be raised and formed during the Great Crusade to arm and equip exploratory expeditions and to garrison outposts in hostile or hazardous regions of the Void. They were also formed more rarely to provide armed diplomatic escorts or deputations to the expeditionary fleets and rogue trader militant fleets. The latter two needs, however, were primarily the provenance of the specialist military commanders of the Mechanicum, not loyal to any single Forge world. The Titan Legions, the Ordo Reductor, the Legio Cybernetica, and the Skitarii of Mars. End quote. And now we come to the elements that make this my most feared faction. But it is not for what the Mechanicum can do to their enemy, but because of what they do to their own. All encompassed in the one word: servitors. When anyone shows interest in the Warhammer universe, they often balk at the things that we have come to know and accept without question. The crenellations on the ships, the haunting religious dirges that fill expansive bays and cathedrals, both in every ship and on every world. The religious zealotry is one thing, but it is not the first to be noted by any new initiate. No. It is the iconography and body horror that make them blanch and turn away. And the vast majority of this visual lexicon is the responsibility of the Mechanicum. The vile cherubim that float around tech priests or fill the upper regions of armoriums and gantries. The lurching cyborgs with no wit of their own, no control, agency, or even opinion on their terrible existences. It is the Mechanicum who are the origin of all of this. A servitor is a thing of terror to anyone who has dwelt on them for even the most fleeting of moments. And it all comes from the very perspective of the Mechanicum. They see all things as machines, be they biological or technological, and so it is that they justify the creation of these monsters. Without any form of empathy, mercy, or pity, the Mechanicum will utilize everything around them, bending all to their will and purpose. They have none of the normal human moral outrage that would inhibit them from these practices. Hence is the body and mind nothing more than a thing, to be maximized and then utilized. The Mechanicum cannot have or ever investigate the use of AI, of course, but this also means that they have a deep mistrust of anything that can work independently of a human soul. Notice I said soul, not necessarily a mind. So, what we would use a microcomputer to perform, an electronic door lock, a small device that cleans the floor, a utility that washes dishes or clothes. These are counter to the very beliefs of the Mechanicum in so many ways. But there is much to be done, much to be produced, upkept and moved. And all of this is done by servitors. But what is a servitor? Many of them are vat-grown clones that are created as flesh chassis, meaning human bodies that can then be altered to the type of servitor required. This is the origin of the haunting cherubim. The Mechanicum do not take babies and alter them. These are cloned vat-grown flesh sacks. Yet, when there are not enough vats and demand outstrips production, or when a criminal is found, tried, and given the ultimate sanction, this is not death. No. That would be far too kind for the Imperium. They are sentenced to servitude in perpetuus, or in Low Gothic, servitude in perpetuity, eternal enslavement. These humans are then taken, stripped of their clothes, and stood in lines awaiting their transformation. They will be taken one by one and placed on a surgeon's slab. And there, the Mechanicum will peel back the skin of their head, open the skull, and then start to slice. The brain will be mutilated, removing all cognizance, will, and personality, lobotomizing them irrevocably. Then, the human will be changed further to match the specifics required. A low-grade servitor will be used to perform repetitive tasks and have very little upgrade, but there are so many forms of servitor. Some will have their limbs removed and replaced with tools to support their new role. Some will have weapons attached in place of said limbs. They will be marched into battle under the command of a tech priest who will use them like we would use a remote-controlled drone or car. Without an order, if their routines are breached, a servitor will either stand or sit in place, silent and unmoving, or they will open their mouths and moan or scream to indicate their required direction or have malfunctioned. The being that was the human is gone, their body being transformed into a utility for the Mechanicum. I shall, of course, do a full video on the various types and uses of servitors in the future, if I gain the fortitude to do so. As stated, I find the servitors to be as terrifying as the predations of the Dark Eldar. It is not only in the Mechanicum's flagrant disregard for the human soul, the personality that they will wantonly and callously exterminate with buzzsaws and scalpels. It is the callousness of seeing every last person around them as a potential weapon or labor device. The Mechanicum, more than any other element of the setting, is what makes it so grim and dark. Everyone is an object to be used. And I personally feel that it is the use of servitors, their proliferation amongst the Great Crusade and the Imperium that has, more than any other reason, totally desensitized the entire human race. As will be seen in the age of the Imperium, human life is cheap, nothing more than a statistic on a spreadsheet, where untold millions of men and women will be marched towards enemy emplacements just to see the placement of their guns, to denude them of ammunition before the real assault can begin. And I feel that it is the servitor that has made all of this possible. The merest acceptance of these shambling abominations is a crime against everything that made humanity great. Everything. Alas, I feel that we must draw this entry to a close now. In the coming months, we shall see how the Martian Civil War was triggered, the coming of the Scrap Code, the breaking of the Mechanicum, and the birth of the Adeptus Mechanicus and Dark Mechanicum. We shall also explore the hidden truths of Mars and its adepts, the nature of the dragon, what it means, what it heralds, and then what the future holds with the coming or return of Archmagos Belisarius Core. I look forward to it greatly. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. If you have enjoyed this video, then do please consider liking and subscribing, turning on notifications, and potentially even joining our Patreon or giving a one-off super thanks if I have indeed earned your bounty. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.